I will record. Good. So, welcome, everyone. My name is Oana Cojocaru-Mirédin of Technion. Welcome to the Israel Vacuum Society webinar series on advanced characterization methods for materials and interfaces. This time, we chose to focus on atom probe tomography, which is not very well known so far, but is very important as a complementary technique for electron microscopy and other types of spectroscopy. So for this purpose, we invited a leading scientist in the atom probe tomography community who will be talking on atom probe tomography and correlative microscopy. And I'm privileged to introduce Professor Oana Cojocaru-Mirédin, of the University of Freiburg, Germany. A few words about our speaker. Oana received her PhD degree in physics in 2009 from University of Rouen in France, and afterwards she worked as a postdoc until 2012 at the Max Planck Institute in Düsseldorf, Germany. And then in 2015 she moved to RWTH Aachen University in Germany, and since 2022 she's a professor at the cross-scale material characterization University of Freiburg, Germany. And the research interests include the characterization and processing of compound semiconductors for energy applications by means of correlative microscopy, as she will be showing today. So, Oana, thank you very much for taking this important task, and I welcome you to tell us about correlative microscopy. Please.
Thank you very much, Yaron, for this very nice introduction. I hope everyone hears me clearly. Yes, nice. So indeed, today I have the task to present to you the atom probe tomography and the correlative microscopy. Correlative microscopy means the combination of the atom probe tomography with other characterization techniques, so that we can determine several material properties on the exact same position of the sample. And I have the task today to present you some examples with what we can achieve with this new methodology. So, but before doing so, I would like to present to you the outlook of my presentation today. So I'm going to present to you the principle of the atom probe tomography, and also I'm going to present you some applications of what can be achieved with the atom probe tomography in general in material science. Then I'm going to present also the application of correlative microscopy, this time for thermoelectrics, and I hope you would be impressed of what can be achieved with that. So let's start with the principle of the atom probe tomography. So, as the name is said, atom probe tomography, it's a tomographic method. So it means that we can image a 3D object by sectioning into 2D slices. So you'll see later that basically on the atom probe tomography, we have atoms which arrive. So we have a detector, which is a 2D dimensional object. And we have the atoms which arrived on the detector. It's a position-sensitive detector. So basically, we get 2D planes for successive times. And then if we reconstruct and recombine all these 2D slices, then we get a 3D object. And this is all about atom probe tomography. We'll have in science several tomographic methods, and I provide you here these methods, a function of the resolution and the field of view. So of course, for very high field of view and high resolution, we have the X-ray tomography. And then by going down with the field of view almost linearly, we have the nanosims and the focused ion beam. And then we have, of course, the possibility to have a tomography with EDX and F10 ILS in TM capabilities. And then we look now here, the atom probe tomography had the lowest field of view, but the highest resolution. So it means that basically with the atom probe tomography, we would be able to probe everything or all structures which happens at the nanometer level. So this is the biggest advantage of the atom probe, but of course the field of view is reduced and it's not bigger than 100 nanometer. So why do we need this tomographic method and why do we need atom probe tomography? Yeah? So in principle, this is very useful to tackle phenomenon which occurs at the atomic or the nanometer scale. You can obtain valuable information, like for example, the elemental distribution inside a material at the real space. And there are, and because it's of the real space, in this case, we can deal with many phenomena which occurs at the near nanometer or atomic level. And these are partitioning or segregation at the internal interfaces. We can even, and I'm going to show you today, have the possibility to characterize the defects. And I'm not speaking about point defects, but structural defects. And these are the grain boundary, the phase boundary, the dislocations. And then we can also see the precipitation and nanoprecipitation in materials like nucleations and growth, even spinodal decomposition. We can also quantify the diffusion processes, and this is very useful for semiconductor devices. And we can, for example, determine the interdiffusion, the grain boundary diffusion. And nowadays, there are many materials which are suitable for the atom probes, and this is also due to the technical developments. At the beginning, at the early stages, the atom probe was able only to characterize very conductive materials like metals and alloys. But with the time, by inserting also the laser, more insulator materials like semiconductor, insulator, ceramics, polymers could also be investigated. You will see also in the very recent years, very sophisticated or exotic materials like porous materials, biological materials, and also organic. So we see papers on bones, proteins, even water. There were also some research work on beer. So there's plenty of very exotic research work with the atom probe. And this shows also that over the years, the atom probe had increased its capabilities and also its possibilities to characterize a very huge, diverse material class. So how the atom probe began? Well, this all began with Erwin Müller in 1950s, and he is considered to be the father of high-field nanoscience, and he is the inventor for the field ion microscopy. And you see here the picture of him, and here is a typical field ion microscope set up by that time. It has nothing to do with what we have now in the labs. We are going to see later on. But at least this, at the beginning, it was not sophisticated setup, so it were some glass tubes. And inside we had a very high vacuum. And we inserted a sample, very important. The sample, in this case, it's a needle-shaped specimen with a very small radius. And we had, of course, under the vacuum, on the sample had been applied a bias, a DC voltage, and also it had inserted an image gas. And what happens, of course, we have an antenna effect, we have a needle shape, so that means an electric field had been built up on the apex of the tip. And then the ions from the image gas is going to be perturbed on the surface of the tip. They are going to be ionized and then field evaporated or accelerated towards the fluorescence grid. And what we get, for example, if we have here a tungsten needle, what we get this type of images. So this is film images, so-called field ion microscope image, where we can image the position of the atoms on the surface of the needle. So we see nicely that each position here corresponds to an atom, and then we have terraces of atoms, we have crystallographic poles, and for example, for the tungsten, we have the big 110 pole for the tungsten. So we can nicely map the structure, the tip surface of and the atomic redistribution within the structures. So what we can do also by reversing the bias on the needle, we do not anymore extract the ions, but the electrons. So there is also a reverse so-called technique, which have not been explored at all in science, and this is called the field electron emission microscope, and it's an open science nowadays. So what are the methodologies which have been used and developed within the years? So as I said, in the 1950s, we have the field ion microscopy with Erwin Müller. Then Panitz had come and then have developed the concept of atom probe, because field ion microscope does not say anything about the chemical identity. It just says how the ions are distributed structurally on the surface of the tip. But if we combine that with a mass spectrometer, and then we measure the time of light of each impact, we could then calculate back what would be the time of light of each impact and determine the chemical identity of each atom. And then, since 1968, it started to be developed the real capabilities of the atom probe tomography. And this is how it has been called in 1988 and later in 1993, atom probe tomography. So this is the widely used acronym worldwide. It had been also an attempt given by the Sydney group by calling this technique atom probe microscopy. But of course, atom probe tomography is really the widely used terminology. The instruments, well, we had a bunch of instruments since 1960s, 1970s, and these are the 1D atom probes. So at the beginning, we didn't have a 3D map, but we were just having a succession of atoms on a detector, and this was called the 1D atom probe, but had been quickly developed towards the 3D atom probe and had been commercialized by Oxford Nanoscience in UK. Then in 1973, there was some efforts to develop the imaging atom probe, but without being very successful. In 1980s, the Oxford group had developed the position-sensitive atom probe. So the detector had been strongly developed so that it gets much more sensitive to the position of the atom on the detector, and had been commercialized by Oxford Nanoscience. But in parallel, in 1993, the French group, the competitors, let's say, have developed also the tomographic atom probe and had also developed the laser-assisted. For the first time, the French group had introduced the possibility in 2005, 2006, the possibility to analyze the materials by employing a laser, and this is the laser-assisted wide angle, which means that it allows also to investigate a much bigger tip, wide angle tomographic atom probe, and had been commercialized by Cameca for many years. And then in parallel in 2003, the LIP systems, the local electrode atom probe, had also been commercialized by Imago. So what is the status now? Basically, the French LAWATAP is not anymore commercialized. The Imago company had been bought by Cameca, by Amete Cameca, and they decided to close the LAWATAP setup developed by the French group, and they only develop nowadays the LIP systems, and other new system appeared on the market by the same company, which are the Inviso and ICOS. So this is what we have nowadays. This is the LIP system 6000 HR. So it has nothing to do with what Erwin Müller had at the beginning, these small tubes, crystal tubes. But here indeed we have really a big setup. On the left-hand side, we have the software. On the right-hand side, we have the hardware. And we see that we have three main chambers. We have the lot lock, where we insert the sample inside the atom probe, the storage chamber, the buffer chamber, where we store our sample, and we can store up to 35 samples. And we have here in this white box the main chamber with the laser where the experiments are conducted. So the atom probe tomography is quite available worldwide, so it's not anymore that unknown technique. And you see that it's very widely spread in USA, in Europe, in Japan, and also many tools over the last year have been bought by many research institutes in China. In Australia also there are a few setups, and the availability of these setups is going to increase more and more worldwide. So if we look in Germany, there are several universities, mainly the biggest university, they have an atom probe available. And this is also the case of the University of Freiburg, where I'm sitting nowadays, and I'm going to receive soon a LIB 5000 system. So let's discuss about the principle of the atom probe tomography. Well, as I said, we need to have a needle-shaped specimen. And this needle-shaped specimen is inserted inside a high vacuum, and the radius should be very small, should be below 50 nanometer. We apply also a cooling to the needle so that we avoid to have diffusion of the atoms on the apex of the tip. And we apply a DC voltage so that a high electric field is available on the apex of the tip. So what we apply more, and this is crucial for the atom probe, and basically this defines the two modes that the atom probe can be used. So we apply the electric pulses and the laser pulses. So I schematize here with the laser pulses because I'm mainly working with semiconductor materials, and they require, of course, a laser, and a voltage pulses will not be sufficient. But what happens under these pulses basically is that we have the field evaporation of the atoms from the needle apex, and the detection of these atoms impacts on a position-sensitive detector. So we get basically the XY positions, and we get the time of flight for each impact. So because there is a mass spectrometer, from the time of flight, we can determine the chemical identity of each impact, and with the position on the detector, we can use this information to do at the end a 3D reconstruction. So this is what we get. I have to change to show you a map. So this is a typical 3D map that we have in the atom probe tomography. So this is a copper indium gallium diselenide thin film solar cell, which it's used as an absorber for the solar cell materials. And there was the questions, because the sodium had strongly improved the efficiency. The question was, what is the role of sodium and where is the localized? And with the atom probe tomography, we show for the first time that indeed sodium here in green, it's strongly segregated at the grain boundaries, and we could even give the exact composition at the specific grain boundary. So with that, it means that the atom probe tomography is really a very ideal tool to determine the small compositional changes, even at the grain boundaries at the interface, and you can do that down to the ppm level. Okay, let's switch back. So yeah, to the laser pointer. So if I could conclude for the principle of the atom probe, of course, you need to understand that it's a combination of the time of flight mass spectrometry and ion projection microscopy. And also you need to understand that we have a needle-shaped specimen, which is very small, very tiny, a few nanometer. And then we have a 2D detector, which is 10 by 10 centimeter. So we can have a huge magnification process. And this magnification, it's in principle between 1 and 10 million times. So it means that also for the reconstruction, this has to be taken into account so that we have a correct reconstruction, the reconstruction at the end. So what is the basic phenomenon for the atom probe tomography? Well, this is called the field evaporation phenomenon. And the field evaporation, if this is a metal surface, means the removal of an atom when we have a high electric field. And what are the processes for removing this atom? Where we have two processes. First of all, we have the desorption of the atoms, the atom, and the ionization of this atom. So how the potential diagram look like? So basically, we have here the potential curve for the atom in gray, and we see that we have a huge barrier. So if we would extract an atom, we need to overcome this huge barrier to extract an atom from the surface of the metal. And this physically, it's almost impossible. Now, if we have it in ionized state, we see already that this potential barrier is slightly reduced. But what is the big advantage is that if we apply a field, the potential curves change strongly. And you see here how the potential curve for an ion change upon when we apply a field. So basically, we end up to have a very small activation barrier for field evaporation, QF, that we need to overcome so that we have field evaporation. And there are two ways of overcoming this potential barrier, and this depends very much of how we use the atom probe. If we apply the laser mode, then we are in high temperature condition, and to overcome this potential, we say that we are overcoming through the agitation energy. If we apply a voltage pulse or voltage mode, then we are at low temperature condition, and overcoming this barrier would be done by tunneling. So because I'm working with semiconductor and laser, it's a must to have a part within the atom probe. We can say that the field evaporation it's commonly described as a thermally activated process, and that the evaporation rate is strongly dependent on the activation barrier for field evaporation. And we can define now the evaporation barrier for field evaporation from this potential diagram. And this would be basically the binding energy of the surface atom, the ionization energy minus the field that had been applied, because the field, of course, reduces strongly the activation barrier for field evaporation. So we end up to have this formula. Well, determining the evaporation field so what you need to know is that the evaporation field changes upon the material changes from one element to the other. So it's essential actually to determine the evaporation field so that at the end we can do the 3D reconstruction, because we know that the evaporation field equals to voltage over the beta R. Beta is a geometric parameter and R is the radius of the tip. So we know the voltage we apply. If we know the evaporation field, then we can do the 3D reconstruction by determining the radius of our 3D reconstruction. So since this is so important, it was important to be able to determine the evaporation field for different materials, different elements. And this is the table where it shows how to determine the evaporation field by applying this approximation, where it says when the field is equal to evaporation field, then the activation barrier is equal to 0. So if we have this equation and we make it equal to 0, then we can subtract the evaporation field being this given by this parameter. And by calculation, we could determine, I mean, this is done since long ago in science, and the evaporation field could be determined for different elements. So what we see here, we see basically that we have F1, F2, and F3. So what does it mean? So we have the evaporation field for single charge ion, the evaporation field for double charge ion, and the evaporation field for triple charge ion. Well, we see that the lithium, the evaporation field for single charge ion, it's much lower than the double charge ion, and the difference is huge. It means that in a mass spectrum, we are mainly going to see lithium as a single charge ion. Well, for the beryllium, it's not the case. You see that the difference between the single charge ion and the double charge ion, it's not that much. So we most probably see in the mass spectrum both charge ions, and the one which prevailed would be even the double charge ion element. So we know exactly from the theory what we should expect from the mass spectra, and in which proportion we should expect this quantity. Okay, so after this a small introduction on the atom probe tomography, I'm going to give you some examples of how the atom probe tomography can be used in material science. And I'm starting with an example that we work with Yaron Amrial, so from Technion, in Israel, so near Institute. So, and what we have studied here, it was basically to understand how the silver impact the lethal thermoelectrics. And to understand that, and to understand the impact on to better understand also the impact on the electronic properties, we would have to understand also how silver is redistributed within this material. And you see that we have done correlative or joint characterization. Is not yet really correlative in the sense that I will present you at the end, but we investigated this sample using the TM and atom probe. From the TM, we found out that this material has a huge density of dislocations, and not only inside the bulk, but also at low angle grain boundaries. So we know that low angle grain boundaries are basically defined as an array of dislocation. So inside the bulk, what we observe with the atom probe is indeed that we have a high density of dislocation, and that these dislocations are decorated by silver. So basically, silver easily decorates the dislocations, the grain boundaries in these thermoelectric materials, and we see nicely here, for example, one single dislocation, how silver segregate. We can even determine the composition. So here on the right-hand side, we have the composition of the dislocation. And we see that the silver concentration is almost 10% of the dislocation core. You see here also below a low angle grain boundary with an array of dislocations, and now it's a projection from the top of this low angle grain boundary, and we see nicely the lines and how silver decorate these dislocations. So now, of course, this is very fancy, but you can wonder yourself for what is good for. I mean, okay, this shows already that silver is accumulated at the dislocation. It's nice, but is this relevant for science? And the answer is yes. So actually, for the thermoelectrics, the nanostructuring had been used to reduce the lattice thermoconductivity. So this parameter here. And had been observed by inserting silver, it helps to reduce this lattice thermoconductivity. And by we measured also, so we have here, for example, these pink dots are the experimental data for the measured lattice thermoconductivity for different temperatures. And we try to fit with a known Debye-Callaway model for thermoelectrics. We try to fit this experimental data, and you see that the calculated data were in green. So we see clearly a deviation between the experimental data and the green line. And by having these results and having this high dislocation density and the composition of this dislocation, we could refurbish our Debye-Callaway model and implement this parameter, and we could obtain the new fit, not the new fit, but the new model, the red line. And you see in this case that we have a very good match between the experimental data and our model containing the dislocation and the concentration at the dislocation score. So you see already that the atom probe tomography results are really very useful also for theory, because it gives you really hints with what happened down to the nanometer level. And if the proportion of this mechanism or effects is strong, then will strongly change also your simulations or your calculations that you have applied for specific material. So this is another example with what we have published very recently this year, and I encourage you, if you have time to read this paper, I hope you'll not be deceived. And this was also done in cooperation with Professor Amrial and Max Planck Institute, where again we have investigated the precipitation inside the lead telluride thermoelectrics and the impact on the ZT parameter, on the efficiency of this material. And with the TM again, we see a big zoo of defects, and from very small defects, very spherical ones, to plate-like defects, precipitates, to even very huge precipitates. And this precipitate could also be identified with the atom probe. So we see very small nanocrystalline with composition of no more than 30 atomic percent for silver. Then we have this bigger precipitates, plate-like precipitates with composition a bit higher than 40 atomic percent of the lead, of silver. And then we have the bigger one. You see here the scale bar had strongly increased, and also the silver concentration increases. We could even see at the end bigger, really big precipitates, which correspond to the silver telluride precipitates. And we see nicely here that the composition of this silver telluride precipitates also correspond really to the silver to tellurium phase, so, which means that they are really very pure silver telluride precipitates. So it means that within this material we have an evolution, and we have the nucleation, the growth, the coarsening, and the formation of the silver telluride, and we could map with the atom probe the whole evolution of this within the lead telluride. We went even farther. We have investigated the interface between the silver telluride and lead telluride, and we found it by TM that they are indeed coherent interfaces. We saw also with the atom probe, again, this nicely shows the capabilities of the atom probe to identify the lattice planes. So we see the lattice planes in the lead telluride, which correspond to the 200, and the lattice planes in lead telluride, which is 002. So we have these lattice planes which are parallel to each other, and show nicely that we have this coherency in agreement with the TM. So this had been, I'm not a big expert of computational calculation, but Jaron has a big expertise with that, and he implemented all these experimental findings within his DFT calculation code, and he found it indeed that these interfaces are interfaces with the lowest interface energy, and really make very sense for the system to evolve towards this this kind of interfaces, so that we have a minimization of energy within the system. Now, this is another very interesting aspect for the thermoelectrics, where it shows nicely the capability of the atom probe to probe bonding. So bond means the region between the atoms, right? So we very often schematize that in chemistry with a small line, although in physics this is more like a cloud of electrons around two atoms. And with the atom probe tomography, and within the last years where I was still at RWTH University, and together with Professor Wuttig, we have seen that there are materials which have a very peculiar bonding mechanism, and we have called that metavalent bonding. And if you look in the literature, there are many papers which have risen up in the last years about this new bonding mechanism. But how the atom probe can probe this bonding? Basically, what we have in the atom probe experiments, we want to break the bonds and take out the atoms from the surface of a tip. So we have, in principle, with the atom probe, bond breaking experiments. And we can look then how the bond breaks behavior take place for different materials. And we did so. And for example, if we take typically the lead telluride, and we have a sample containing lead telluride material, we have a very high, we call probability of multiple events. So what are these? So you see here there are different times of evaporation. And normally, when we have a laser pulse, per laser pulse, we should have a single event. So we see here that for T2, T4, and this is the only ones. We have single events, but normally for regular metallic system, we have one single event. The proportion of one single event is higher than 90%. And we have very small proportion of multiple events. It means that for one laser pulse, we have two events arriving at the same time on the detector. So, but for this peculiar material, for the lead telluride, we have a really very high proportion of multiple events. And if we look here at the PME value, we see that this is at least 60%. And this is much higher what have been expected in the literature, that is to be below 30%, which is the case for the silver telluride. So we have here, and we see nicely in the 3D map, this is a PME map, that we have the matrix, which is the lead telluride, and we have the silver telluride precipitates, which are a covalently bonded system, and which appear here like a dark bluish. Yeah, so we have a transition from high PME to low PME. So we have a transition from metavalent bonding to covalent bonding. And high PME, it was not only observed for PBTA, but it had been observed for many, many material class. And there is, I encourage you to read this article. There are many materials which contains these high PME values. And these materials are not only used as a thermoelectrics, but are used also as phase change materials, because there you need to have a very quick transition between metavalent and covalent bonding between crystalline and amorphous states. So we could conclude in this work that these interfaces between metavalent and covalent bonding are the interfaces which are very beneficial for the thermoelectrics, because they can easily scatter the phonons at their position and then reduce the lattice thermoconductivity. So another example are the grain boundaries in silicon. So silicon, multicrystalline silicon, it's used as a solar cell. We know that the highest efficiency for silicon solar cell is 27%, but this is obtained for single crystalline, not multicrystalline. But we know that for industry and for application, having single crystalline is much more expensive than multicrystalline silicon. So why we cannot use multicrystalline silicon for solar cell? Where we could use it, but the problem is that the efficiency is much lower, and we could observe that the reduction of the efficiency is mainly obtained at the grain boundary, and this reduction is due to the recombination between the charge carrier. So we know a solar cell, we have to collect the electrons and holes to charge separate them and collect them, and to reduce the recombination so that the collection would be increased in the external circuit. So what we observed, in fact, is that the faceted grain boundaries in silicon solar cell are very detrimental, and the industry could not answer the question why. And we observed with the atom probe that indeed at the faceted grain boundary, we have the distribution or the accumulation of iron and carbon. And iron, it's a well-known element which will increase if it accumulates at the grain boundary. It creates deep charge defects, and then it's increasing the recombination between electrons and holes. But I'm speaking about faceted grain boundary, and here we have no signature of faceting from this segregation phenomenon. Therefore, but if we go and enlarge a small portion of this grain boundary portion, we see nicely that the facets appears, and this given by the fact that we clearly see the contrast from 1-1 plane, and we see also nicely in TM exactly same position. How does it look like these facets? So, and the 1-1-1 plane corresponds exactly to the 1-1 plane that are mined also in the atom probe. And what was new and have never been presented before is that the facets, the segregation of iron and carbon take place at the lower king and not necessarily at the upper king. Therefore, we end up to see this kind of segregation because basically the segregation takes place only at the lower kink of the facet, but not on the upper kink. And if we look within the depth of our 3D map, we see that these impurities, the iron and carbon, segregate all over the depth along the facet, the lower kink of the facet over the entire depth. So with that, we could introduce the notion of the strain-induced asymmetric line segregation, where the segregation takes place at the lower kink and not on the upper kink. And this it's kind of novel science which had been discovered and have been published together with the people from Max Planck in 2018. So why this information are important? So these are very important simply because by providing this information to the industry, they were able to change the growth procedure so that the faceting of the grain boundary can be reduced and the proportion of this faceted grain boundary can be reduced and then further increase the efficiency of the devices. And the last example before going to our correlative microscopy approach are the solid electrolytes. So maybe some of you have already an electric car and we have the batteries. And we know that in our actual batteries, we have the cathode, anode, and in between we have a liquid electrolyte. Well, the goal in science is to replace this liquid electrolyte with a solid electrolyte because we know that the liquid electrolyte is not that stable at high temperatures or very low temperatures. And we have some other mechanisms which are detrimental for the batteries. And therefore, in science, there is a huge effort to replace this liquid electrolyte with a solid electrolyte. So with that, we have started to understand the solid electrolyte and analyze it with the atom probe. So we first use a standard SEM and took the solid electrolyte, this is the lithium lanthanum zirconium oxide. We broke one small cell and we looked in the cross section and we see indeed that we have a polycrystalline structure with very well-defined crystals. And what we saw by using the backscatter detector is that we have at the grain boundary position, and specifically at the triple points, really dark regions. And we know that the change in the contrast with the backscatter detector, it means also a change in composition. So the question is, what happens there, what we have for the solid electrolytes? You need to understand that a solid electrolyte should allow a very fast diffusion of the lithium ions between the cathode and the anode, which will allow a very fast charging, a discharging process. So the solid electrolyte, it's very important to allow for the lithium ions to diffuse very quickly. And what we saw by subtracting a very small portion at the grain boundary is that, and preparing the tip, so here's the grain boundary inside the tip, we saw that we have a lithium segregation at the grain boundary position. And this have not been observed for one single grain boundary, but have been observed for many of them. And you see that I saying lithium segregation, but in fact is not the segregation phenomenon that we have in German material science, where we have few ppm to atomic percent of impurities which are segregated there. But here we have really a huge accumulation with lithium content going from 30 to almost 90%. So we have a huge accumulation of a wide region of lithium at the position of the grain boundary. And of course, the question for the battery community arises, and this is, what is the impact of this huge accumulation of the lithium on the grain boundary? Of course, lithium should stay mobile and should be available so that it can really travel very fast between the cathode and the anode. But what happens now when it's strongly accumulated at the grain boundary? What would be the impact on the capacity of the battery and on the lithium ion conductivity overall within the material? So you see that the atom probe shows effects and which rise up questions for the redesign later on to be better tackled. And now, least but not least, I'm going to show you the correlative microscopy for the lead telluride thermoelectrics. And here we have a nice example of the thermoelectrics. We know that, and I told that at the beginning, that the thermoelectrics is defined by the ZT parameter. And in order to have high efficiency, we want to have a high ZT parameter. But how can we have this high ZT parameter? Simply by increasing the Seebeck coefficient, the electrical conductivity, and by reducing the thermal conductivity. So the problem is when we increase the electronic conductivity, the thermal conductivity also very often increases, because you see that the thermal conductivity has two components, has the electronic part of the thermal conductivity and lattice thermal conductivity. So it means that all these parameters are interconnected, and it's very difficult to change one parameter without influencing the other. Therefore, as I said also at the beginning or in the middle of my presentation, I presented different examples. A new approach was to insert nanostructures, which will allow to have a selective transport effect. And one of these nanostructures for the lateral right are the grain boundaries. So if this grain boundary ideally would be transparent for the electron diffusion and will ensure a very high electronic conductivity, but they scatter the phonons, yeah, and will reduce hence the lattice thermal conductivity. So this would be ideal and will ensure a very good thermoelectric material with very high performance. But the question is, and I think this had never or very rarely been discussed in science, how we can determine the transport mechanism at the grain boundaries in the lateral right. Well, while I was still in Aachen University, and this had been published, a work which had been published last year, we have developed a new methodology which allows actually to determine for the grain boundary the structure, the transport property, and the composition. So how are these done? Basically, these are the 4 steps that we employ. So here we have the laterite material. In SEM, we see different contrasts from different grains. We use the EBSD, which EBSD shows us the orientation of the grains. And if we know the orientation of the grains, we can determine the misorientation at the grain boundary position. And for example, if we concentrate on this grain boundary, which is a 45-degree misorientation angle, we can then construct or mill out or fabricate a lamella out of this grain boundary, and this lamella will look like that with the grain boundary sitting here. So we take then this lamella and we mount it on a whole bar setup or chip where it contains many gold contacts, and we make a contact between our lamella and the gold contacts. We have here 4 contacts, and the grain boundary is here in the middle, and we apply a current to it. We can even apply a magnetic field, and we can determine, of course, with that the electronic properties. This is typically how a whole setup is working. So we can apply the electronic conductivity, we can determine the electronic conductivity, the mobility, and the charge carrier concentrations. And at the end, the last setup, it's the last step, sorry, is to determine the composition of the position of the grain boundary by simply fabricating a tip out of this grain boundary and determining the composition with the atom probe tomography. So with this concept, we are able now for the first time to determine the interconnection between the transport, structure, and composition down to the grain boundary level and a portion of a grain boundary. So these are the results we have obtained. So we have the mobility versus the temperature, and we have done this characterization for different types of grain boundary with different misorientation angles. From material science, we know when we have a high misorientation angle above 15 degrees, we have they are called high angle grain boundary, and misorientation angle below 15 degrees, they are called low angle grain boundary. And I also say that before, low angle grain boundary are defined with the dislocation array. So what we see here, basically we see that at room temperature, we have no differentiation between the bulk, which is gray, and the other grain boundaries. So basically at room temperature, the electron mobility, it's behaving for all the same, so the grain boundary are not scattering anything. But the differences start to appear below 150K. And we see nicely here that we have a big differentiation and a big scattering phenomenon for the Hanger grain boundary. We observe still scattering at 7-degree misorientation angle, but we have no scattering of the electrons at the low misorientation angles. And this was really very interesting. So we have already a very nice fit between the misorientation angle and the transport at the grain boundary position. And for the thermoelectric material, there is the so-called grain boundary dominated carrier scattering model. So we didn't develop it ourselves, so it's well known in the literature. And this model shows that the mobility is directly proportional to the barrier height. So basically, by having the mobility values, we could also determine the barrier height for all these grain boundaries. And these are the quantification of the barrier height at the grain boundary position for low angle grain boundary and high angle grain boundary. So we see nicely that for the low angle grain boundary, we have very low barrier height, and this is 5 to 6 times higher for the high angle grain boundaries. But the question was for us, okay, this is already very nice. As a result, we see a nice correlation between the structure and the structure and the electronic transport, but why it's happening so? And therefore, we have prevailed and characterized these grain boundaries also with the atom probe. And here it shows nicely the atom probe measurement for the lower grain boundary at 7-degree. And these are the results for the higher grain boundary. Well, the lower angle grain boundary, you know that we have the dislocation, and I showed you already that having silver inside the lateral right, it leads to the silver accumulation at the position of the dislocations. And we know, and we know that when we have very low misorientation angles, it means that the dislocation scores are very far apart from each other. So that means we have very small overlap or no overlap between the dislocation score, and therefore the charge carrier can transport easily through the low angle grain boundary without being disturbed. At 7-degree, we see already here that the distance between the dislocations start to be very short. So we start to have a certain overlap between the dislocation scores, and this will influence the charge carrier and they will scatter some of them. And a high angle grain boundary, we have a full coverage with silver. This will make no difference at room temperature, but at low temperature, and this is very important for low temperature applications, of course. At low temperature, this silver segregation will scatter the charge carrier, so will not allow the electron to diffuse through this grain boundary. And this work also opened us several other questions, because we know that, for example, the barrier height is also proportional to the density of trapping states, to the concentration of ionized impurity. This is the inversion proportional to the concentration of this ionized impurity. We have also the static dielectric permittivity, would be very interesting to determine for the grain boundary. So you see that it opens us more questions, and maybe we could be able in the future to really determine also this parameter and to go towards electronic transport at the nanoscale. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk. So I hope that this talk opened you the vision about the atom probe tomography and what can be done with it, that by combining the atom probe with other microscopy technique, we can obtain a very nice correlation between the structure, composition, and the electronic properties. And this had been done for the grain boundary. I hope you could also observe the strong scattering effects of the Hanger grain boundary for the lateral right, and how this affects the ZT parameter. And last but not least, of course, correlative microscopy and techniques can really provide new insight for designing materials and devices, and it's really very essential. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And of course, the talk is open for questions.
Thank you very much, Oana, for your very interesting and extensive review of the field, which I think provide good balance between technical issues and scientific issues, and we see the recent progress in the field. So the talk is open for questions, so please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. I don't see all of you.
Yes, I have a question if possible. So in order to use this technique, then we need to prepare a sample in the form of this tip. And
Yes.
can you like give sort of a little bit of an explanation of what sort of samples this is? I saw you can do this on a lot of different kinds of samples, but if there's limitations and what the actual process is to form these.
Very good question. So actually, depending on the material that you are using, you can use very simple techniques to very sophisticated. Yeah? So if you have a metallic system or an alloy, whatever, so you can use electropolishing with solutions, and you can dip a rod inside the solution and apply some potential to it, and then you obtain, after some manipulation, a very small tip and very useful already for the atom probe. So for the metallic system, this had been widely used in the past and until now also. So there is a very simple system, and it's not costly and not sophisticated. Now for semiconductor materials, you have to use the focused ion beam. Of course, because with a focused ion beam, you can, of course, machine or mill your tip in the shape that you want, and you have also the possibility to control the shape and the size and so on and so forth. This requires also, of course, an extensive expertise. So obtaining these very needle shapes free of gallium, not amorphized, and that if damage is happening, it's only on the surface and not deep down inside the tip. This requires really a lot of expertise. So, and typically the students spend 1 year at the beginning to learn how to do that carefully. We did that also in the group with the students. So we typically use the TM to check the quality of and the crystallinity of our atom probe tips and see, and also with the atom probe, you can check if you have gallium implantation inside the tip and how can this be reduced. So there is a really huge field. And I think this is the same with the TM lamellas of how to reduce strongly the contamination on the tip and to preserve the initial structure of our material and the initial composition.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the interesting talk. Could you comment on the possibility to detect light atoms like hydrogen, deuterium, or tritium with the atomic probe?
Yeah, right. So this is a very very key questions, and the atom probe had been strongly developed to tackle these questions. And if you are interested about that, is the group of Batisco in Düsseldorf, in Max Planck Institute. They develop, because the problem is with the atom probe, we have some impurities and very often the hydrogen, which are still in the chamber, and hydrogen or water molecule you can easily get inside the tip. Of course, not in a very high proportion, but it makes your quantitative analysis very difficult to realize. For deuterium, this is easy because we don't have any deuterium inside the chamber, and the deuterium can be easily quantified and had been done. For example, deuterium steels and also in silicon had been strongly analyzed, and this is possible to be fulfilled by any atom probe techniques. But for hydrogen, the atom probe need to be slightly extended and modified so that you can realize at the end a quantitative measurement. You can also do hydrogen charging within the atom probe and directly insert the tip and protect the chamber for the hydrogen contamination. So there are some technical developments which will allow the hydrogen quantification inside materials.
Thanks. Do you have further questions? May I ask something about if you can comment about the instrumentation needed for correlative microscopy? For example, I remember that once there were special holders like a hummingbird, and today it's more easy. If you can comment about this?
Yes, so you are right. So when you do correlative microscopy, ideally, so for example, for the TM, I also did that in the past, and I have in my lab, we have developed with a Japanese company, Hatam, holder, which can go in the TM and the atom probe, because of course you have such tiny tips, and if you want to transport and take from the holder these tiny tips from one holder of atom probe to the other holder of TM, you can destroy them. And to make it really very useful, user-friendly and so on, and much faster to have increase also the yield, then we have such kind of possibilities. Of course, correlative microscopy needs also complementary expertise, complementary techniques, and also opens the possibility to create collaborations, because you might be an expert of the atom probe, but not necessarily an expert of whole setup like I showed here. Here we had a three expertise to reach one study, but it's at the end very rewarding, and I think this also offers the possibility to put the people together to work on a joint project, which it's opens new science, and it's also very rewarding for the group.
Thank you. Okay, do we have further questions? If it's not the case, let us thank Oana again for this very, very nice and insightful talk. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Stopping the recording.